So what is inclusive Wicca? Well, as you'll notice, there is a small I at the beginning of that phrase. And what I'm trying to say with that small I is that it's not a separate tradition. It's a tendency within Wicca to be more inclusive towards LGBT people, LGBT plus, disabled people, older people, people of colour, Black and Indigenous people, basically anybody who is marginalised in some way, or has the potential to be marginalised by mainstream Wicca. Now, when I'm talking about Wicca, I'm talking about the actual initiatory practice of Wicca. There are many different interpretations of the word Wicca, but I'm mainly talking about initiatory Wicca. And the potential for making that practice more inclusive. So let's take a look at some of the aspects of Wiccan ritual that might need a fresh look to make them more inclusive. So one of the things is the practice of consecration. So where you're going around and consecrating all the participants in the circle. Now, traditionally this is done with like the high priest goes around and consecrates all the women, and then the high priestess goes around and consecrates all the men. So now what do you do if the consecrator are non-binary? Who are you going to consecrate? What do you do if the person you're consecrating is non-binary, right? If we're trying to create some kind of connection between magical partners, if you have two magical partners of the same sex, then they might want to consecrate each other. So there are various different ways you can get around this thing. What we've ended up doing, actually copied from somebody else, is that my magical partner goes around and consecrates everybody with the incense, and I do everybody with water and salt. We don't always do it that way. Sometimes we do. You could do it by, get the air and fire signs to consecrate the water and earth signs, or some other way of divvying up the roles. But the point is to think about it and figure out a way of doing it that's more inclusive. Calling the quarters. Now, some people say lords and ladies of the direction or whatever, or even just lords of the watchtowers of the east or whatever. So I try to use a non-gendered expression to call the quarters, so like spirits of the direction kind of thing. So that's gender neutral. So that includes the possibility that the entities we're calling upon might also be non-binary, or have multiple genders, or be gender fluid or whatever, right? Another area is invocation, because the traditional thing is that a man invokes a goddess onto a woman, and a woman invokes a god onto a man. Well, you can have deities you can have any gender combination in that arrangement, right? You can have a man invoking a god onto another man, or a man invoking a goddess onto another man, or a woman invoking a god onto a woman, or a non-binary. You could have two non-binary people and a non-binary deity, or whatever combination of genders, it doesn't matter. There are many different possibilities there, and we don't need to restrict ourselves to having a gender binary arrangement there. Initiation. Now, there was an excellent article recently by Katie Gerard pointing out that same-sex initiation has been around for a long time, and we really need to move past the idea that that it has to be a man a man initiating a woman, or a woman initiating a man. Now, there were good and cogent reasons why that was done back in the day, partly for symbolic reasons, and partly for partly for egalitarian reasons. But it doesn't have to be that way. You know, the majority of people who find meaning and beauty in that way of doing it can carry on doing it that way, obviously. If you're straight, why would you want to do, and if you're straight and cisgender, why would you want to do anything different? But for LGBTQIA people, it's good to have other possibilities on the table and to know that the community will accept those. At the moment, some people, like I think most people actually would say that they probably would accept same-sex initiation. It depends where you are. If you're likely to travel to other people's events or rituals, then it's probably, you know, you probably want to think about whether you're going to do a same-sex initiation or not. Anyway, I am open to doing it, but I haven't actually done one yet, so we will see. And then we have roles in ritual. So there are certain things that are generally reserved for the high priestess to do, and other things that are generally reserved for the high priest to do. Again, this can be swapped around. We don't have to have rigid gender roles in the circle. And again, what are you going to do if you're non-binary, right? And then later on in the presentation, I'm going to talk in more detail about polarity, resonance, and synergy, and some ideas around cakes and wine. And check out my other video on the two chalices ritual, which goes into much more detail about a variant of cakes and wine. Okay, in fact, polarity, resonance, and synergy was the next slide. So polarity is making magic with two things that are opposite to each other. Now, it is often thought that male and female are opposite to each other. Well, I think perhaps they're complementary, but given that gender is pretty much a social construct, and also that the importance we ascribe to categorizing people as male and female in a biological sense is also socially constructed. We don't have to see them as opposites of each other, right? I mean, when I was a baby witch many years ago now, polarity was explained to me as being two ends of a spectrum. Like duality is two separate things. Polarity is two ends of a spectrum that are connected to each other. That's how it was explained to me. But anyway, polarity can be made by any pair of opposites. So extroverts and introverts, or a classic ritual I did one time where we had people who like Marmite and people who like chocolate. Only really works in the UK because us weird Brits are the only people who eat Marmite. But apart from the Australians, they eat Vegemite, don't they? Anyway, hey Australians, woo. Anyways, you can make polarity with any pair of opposites, really. So, and funnily enough, when we actually get into a magical circle, I suddenly find that people aren't really talking about polarity. So I don't know why it's such a big deal anyway. Anyway, there are other possibilities other than polarity. There's resonance, which is having two things that are very similar to each other. So if you think about when you're playing the guitar and you pluck the strings to make a chord, and there are two strings that are next to each other and they start vibrating at like similar frequency to make a chord, that's resonance. And you can have that situation between two or more people in a circle. When it's more people, then I would refer to it as synergy, which is that thing where the energies of all the participants in the circle come together, start swirling around in a harmonious way, and you get an energy that's more than the sum of its parts. So there are many possibilities for making energy. We don't have to stick to polarity. And in fact, I would have said that 99% of the time when we're raising energy in a magical circle, what we're actually doing is making synergy. Now, I have led numerous workshops on the subject of polarity, resonance, and synergy. And the reason I did that was to demonstrate that you can make polarity with lots of different ways of doing it. That doesn't mean that just because I've led that workshop where I go, right, okay, let's get all the extroverts and the introverts and get them doing things, or the morning people and the evening people or whatever. That's not actually how we do stuff in our rituals. The workshop was for demonstration purposes, okay? Just thought I'd get that cleared up. But anyway, when we're actually in the circle, we're just doing whatever we're doing, and you know, all of this stuff is pretty theoretical, to be honest, but it's worth thinking about, because there are so many people who say, oh, but you need a male body and a female body to make polarity. No. You can make polarity with anything. Right, anyway, just get off my hobby horse now. So, the Kybalion 1912 makes it very, very clear that the principle of polarity and the principle of gender are two separate things. Now, must confess that being kind of lazy, I had never heard of the Kybalion until Morgana Sitov pointed it out to me in 2014. So thank you, Morgana. I hope I pronounced your last name correctly, because I've never known how to pronounce it. Anyway, so the principle of polarity, as explained by the Kybalion in 1912, says everything is dual, everything has poles, everything has its pair of opposites. Like and unlike are the same. Opposites are identical in nature but different in degree. Extremes meet, all truths are but half-truths, all paradoxes may be reconciled. So that goes back to the thing that I was told right at the beginning of my magical career, that polarity is two things on a spectrum, right? Very similar. And another insight that was shared with me by Viri Strauss is the idea that, say, for example, I might be yin in relation to that person over there, but I might be yang in relation to that person over there. So in some situations, you could be the force and the other person be the form, and in other situations you could be the form and the other person could be the force. So force and form is another really good example of polarity that has very little to do with gender. So the Kybalion then goes on to say that the principle of gender, which is separate from polarity, please note, gender is in everything. Everything has its masculine and feminine principles. Gender manifests on all planes. So what they're saying there is everything contains a mixture of male and female. So, you know, even if polarity was only male, masculine and feminine, we can make polarity within ourselves by getting our inner masculine and feminine doing that mysterious thingy that makes polarity, right? I mean, I don't think that's a particularly helpful way of looking at it. I think it's all about force and form and yin and yang and all that stuff. But anyway, you know, if everything contains masculine and feminine, then anybody can make polarity with anyone else, even in the view that that you can only make polarity with masculine and feminine principle. So another question that always gets asked in these situations is about fertility. It's like, oh, but you need, you know, you need a male and a female to make babies. Ooh. Well, for one thing, I think the population of the world is quite high enough as it is without, you know, making more babies. And also, when we're talking about fertility of the fields or fertility of the mind, as apparently the late great Alexander's was heard to point out, that when we talk about fertility in Wicca, it's generally fertility of the mind. When you're making that kind of fertility, or even doing sympathetic magic to get the crops to grow, it doesn't need to be a literal male and female thing. Like when we do symbolic magic, you know, putting in a thame in a chalice is a symbolic magic, which can work on many, many levels. You know, you don't need, for symbolic things, you don't need a literal male and female to be doing the deed, right? And in the legends of the Grail, we have a story where two men restore fertility to the land. So the story is that Parsifal is a young, naive knight, and he goes out and he goes on a quest to find the Grail castle. So he gets to the castle of the Grail, and he sees the Fisher King lying wounded in his bed, and he's supposed to ask 3 questions. And the first time he gets there, he doesn't ask any of the questions because his mum told him that you shouldn't ask questions, it's rude. So he sort of stood there going, oh, and then the castle of the Grail vanished away into the mist, and he had to spend, I don't know, ages and ages wandering around the wasteland trying to find it again, because it kept disappearing into the mist. Anyway, eventually he found it again, and this time he asked the right questions. And one of the questions he had to ask was, whom does the Grail serve? And once he had asked the right question, the Fisher King was miraculously healed and fertility was restored to the land. So here we have a story, a traditional story of 2 men making fertility and restoring fertility to the land. I rest my case, my lad. So, polarity. There are many, many different polarities, as I said. When we think about, you know, the ultimate polarity, whatever that might be, there are a number of different candidates for the ultimate polarity. One example could be self and other. It could be spirit and matter. It could be the manifest and the unmanifest. It's much more likely to be one of those things than it is to be male and female. There's a great suggestion from Lynn Landstreet in a splendidly titled article, What's a Nice Dyke Like You Doing in a Polarity-Based Tradition Like This, which she wrote in 1993, where she talks about the lightning striking the primordial waters, bringing forth life. And that, to her, is the ultimate polarity. So a much more abstract, fairly gender-free engendering of life. I think for me, the ultimate polarity has to be probably the manifest and the unmanifest. That's a pretty big one. But on a personal level, clearly self and other. Lover and beloved is another example that's gender-free. You know, if male and female works for you, then great. But consider these other possibilities that are more inclusive of other people who might see it differently. I mean, the thing about when we talk about, you know, the consecration of the wine with an athame, it has multiple levels of symbolism. So it can be the lightning striking the primordial waters. It can be the Godhead penetrating into material reality. It can be a representation of the sexual act. And it can be all of those things at the same time. It's kind of the point of a symbol, that it can be multiple things to multiple people. But if you use words that narrow it down to one particular possibility, that makes it harder for people to see all the different possibilities within it. So that's why I like the words lover and beloved. And I didn't actually come up with those. It was a group of European Wiccans that came up with it. But I really like it. So yeah. Anyway, there are many different possibilities for polarity. One of them is morning people and evening people. You'd be surprised how big of a polarity that is. I did a ritual in Canada at one of my polarity workshops, and we got all the morning people going off and talking about whatever it is that morning people get excited about. I really don't know, because I am definitely a night owl. And then all the night owl people were off in a corner going, yeah, starlight and campfires and the darkness and the stars and the moon and late night chatting around the campfire and woo. And then the morning people came back to the center and we came back to the center, and we swirled all our energies together, and it made, I could almost see a yin yang kind of symbol floating about in the middle of the circle. It's really cool. That's one of my favorites. So it's really good. So the other thing that people generally ask when I give one of my talks on gender and sexuality in the craft is there's bound to be somebody who goes, but what about the tradition? Well, I have to ask you, what is tradition for? Do we exist to serve the tradition, or does the tradition exist to serve us? Who is tradition for? Is it for the people who actually practice the thing, or does it exist, you know, as an entity in its own right that has feelings? Right? The reason tradition exists is because once upon a time, a group of people found a way of doing something that worked for them. So they thought, right, well, write that down, it's really good. And then they passed it on to the next people, and the next people said, oh yeah, that works for us too. And so they passed it on, and so on down the line. Now, eventually, when you have a tradition that gets passed on like that, somebody was bound to say, well, that doesn't quite work for me. Could we kind of tweak it a bit? And either the people who are trying to pass it on to this new person who finds it slightly difficult, either they'll say, no, we can't possibly do that, or they'll figure out a way to expand their horizons a bit to make it work for that new person. So a good example of that is marriage. So over the years, you know, back in the day, prior to the late 19th century, nobody could get divorced. And then, and there were lots of arranged marriages in Europe, because that was the way you made marriage, that you did an arrangement, and it was basically a business arrangement to kind of bring two families together. And then the concept of romantic love came along, and people were like, no, I want to marry the person that I actually feel compatible with, funnily enough. And, you know, and then companionate marriage was invented, where it's like, oh, I actually see my partner as somebody that I actually want to hang out with and stuff. And then, you know, and then divorce became a possibility when you decided you didn't want to hang out with them anymore. And then contraception was invented, and suddenly marriage didn't have to be for procreation anymore. And then so the concept of, you know, marrying for love, companionate marriage, being able to get divorced, and the last thing I said, contraception, completely changed the nature of marriage, right? And that's before same-sex marriage came along. So, you know, if we can get our heads around same-sex marriage, and I don't know many pagans or Wiccans who can't get their heads around same-sex marriage. Like, I don't think I've ever met a single pagan who couldn't get their heads around that. Why can't we get our heads around the concept of same-sex initiation? Don't understand that. It's really weird. Why can't we get our heads around just tweaking the tradition a bit to make it more inclusive, you know, and expanding our ideas a little bit to accommodate people who don't quite, for whom it doesn't quite work. So, you know, when we transmit a tradition, the reason tradition gets transmitted is because it works. And so if a particular aspect of a practice doesn't work, then it usually gets tweaked before it gets passed. And that's normal. That is how traditions evolve. Tradition is not a fixed, set in stone thing. It's a thing that evolves over time, right? So how can we make our rituals more inclusive? So like I said at the beginning, we can do consecrations in a different way, so that we're not just going kind of man consecrates all the women and woman consecrates all the men. We can have morning person consecrates all the night owls, and night owl consecrates all the morning people. Or and then there's always somebody who goes, well, you know, I don't know if I'm a morning person or a night person, you know. So there's an example of being non-binary in the morning person, night owl binary. So there's always one. I mean, I say that as a non-binary person, right? So anyway, you can usually find some kind of polarity that works for everyone, right? Like I said, calling the quarters, you probably, you know, you can think of gender neutral terms for the quarters. And I personally dislike the term watchtowers because I'm like, I feel like I'm summoning a Jehovah's Witness. I just can't say that. Sorry. So I never do. You know, when we do a round dance or the mill of magic or a cone of power, what we're actually doing there is making synergy. We can have, there are lots of situations where we use resonance, creating like with like, bringing two like things together to make magic. By the way, the term resonance was invented by, or used for this purpose, by Eddie Gutierrez, known as Hyperion, who was the founder of the Unnamed Path. And the Unnamed Path was also a podcast that he did, and it's all still available online, so check it out. Like I said, you can make polarity with many different things. And the other thing is the two chalices ritual, which I have another video up about, and I will put a link to that. But basically the two chalices ritual was based on the idea you have two chalices, and you pour from one chalice into the other to make, and then it gets passed around the circle. So, and it started life as something that two women could do. And then I just realized it doesn't need to be two women. It can just be an alternative to the standard athame and chalice business. So image credits. The Inclusive Wicca logo here was concept by me, and this design of it was done by Chris Turk. It's free to use for non-commercial purposes. Slides 2 and 3, the chalices were from this Pinterest link. Slide 3, the athame, came from paganpages.org, and all of the other images I've used were public domain. So, further reading. All Acts of Love and Pleasure Inclusive Wicca was, I wrote that in, it was published in 2014, and this is where I laid out a lot of these ideas, and then I had more ideas, so then I had to write more books, which are on the next slide, or the slide after next. Recently published Outside the Charmed Circle by Misha Maudlin. I haven't started reading this yet, but I think this is going to be well worth the read. Casting a Queer Circle, Non-Binary Witchcraft by Thizda Minai is an excellent book. Lots of fantastic ideas in there, particularly the stuff about non-gendered roles in ritual, very good. And also very fond of Queer Paganism, a Spirituality that Embraces All Identities by Joe Green. Again, lots of really good ideas in there. And I've also got a list of queer pagan books on my blog at Dowsing for Divinity. Okay, do check out my other videos on this channel. I've been doing Potted History of Witchcraft, Potted History of Paganism, Key Ideas in Paganism, and lots of other things. So don't forget to hit the subscribe button, and don't forget, if you liked this video, don't forget to hit the like button, because that means it gets more dissemination on YouTube. Okay. So finally, check out my books, Dark Mirror, The Inner Work of Witchcraft, and The Night Journey, Witchcraft's Transformation, which contain a lot more ideas about inclusive Wicca, group dynamics, coven leadership, and embodied spirituality. and you can get these from shop.dorianvaliente.org and soon on all the major online outlets. So that's all for now. Blessed be. See you next time.